Well, welcome back, everybody. Today we are continuing to look at nationalism in the wake of the War of 1812, talking about how nationalism shows up in some other ways outside of the economy. So, last time we were focusing on economic nationalism with the American system, with industrialization, with attempts to make the national government stronger and a stronger economy by way of national strength with things like the national bank. Internal improvements and all of that. Today, we are going to look at how nationalism shows up in some other ways, particularly in some court cases, judicial nationalism, and also how nationalism starts to show up in American foreign policy with expansion, continued expansion into some new areas, but also that expansion, as well as a few other things. The United States being just a little bit more aggressive is too strong of a word, but maybe assertive is a better word. The United States being a little bit more direct in what it wants and kind of trying to stand on its own 2 feet, kind of standing up to Europe a little bit, flexing a little bit of muscle when it came to foreign policy. So let's talk about judicial nationalism and the Supreme Court boosting national power. Recall that nationalism means, or part of how nationalism is manifested, is a stronger national government. And the national government was assuming more power by enacting things like the American system and chartering a national bank. But we are also going to see some Supreme Court cases in this era that are also going to add power or raise the power, increase the power of the national government. There's 2 cases we're going to look at here. And while they are very, very different, they involve different issues. What they are both going to do is, in one way, shape, or form, they are both going to increase the power of the federal government because they both have something to do with federal power versus state power. Both of these cases are going to involve essentially that same dilemma of federal power versus state power. And in both of these cases, the court is going to decide in favor of the national government and overrule the states. Before we look at those cases, there's a particular individual we need to mention, and that is Chief Justice John Marshall. Chief Justice John Marshall was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, obviously, for quite a long time. He had very long tenure for several decades on the Supreme Court and wasn't the first Chief Justice, but it is under his leadership that the Supreme Court takes on a bigger role and where we see these rather nationalistic decisions being made. He was actually the Chief Justice in the Marbury case that we talked about previously, and he's the Chief Justice in both of these cases. So he did a lot to really shape exactly what the court's role was, like he did in Marbury versus Madison. He wrote that decision about it's the court's job to declare laws unconstitutional, so forth and so on. But he also tended to favor the national government. So he's also credited with not only increasing the power of the court, but increasing the power of the national government. Because when it came down to these dilemmas between national power and state power, he overwhelmingly tended to support and interpreted the Constitution to mean that the national government had more power. So he's really instrumental when it comes to judicial nationalism. Now, the first of these cases is called McCulloch versus Maryland, which unfortunately is easy to confuse with Marbury versus Madison because they sound a lot alike and they both have these M names in them. But McCulloch versus Maryland is a different case. McCulloch versus Maryland involved the National Bank. And you remember that the National Bank was rechartered as part of the American system. And that actually reignited some of the same issues that it did before. There were a lot of people that did not like the bank, that thought the bank was unconstitutional, that thought the bank was too powerful, that felt it was an overreach of federal power, that it was harmful to the lower classes, that it only benefited the wealthy, those same things. Well, in this case, McCulloch versus Maryland, the state of Maryland attempted to tax the national bank. That is the basis of the case, is that the state of Maryland attempted to tax the branch of the national bank that was there in Maryland. McCulloch was the name of the president of that branch of the bank. So they attempted to tax it the same way that they would tax any other business. But this became a constitutional issue because the president of that branch of the national bank said, we don't have to pay state taxes. We are a branch, or we are an arm, rather. We are sort of a part of the federal government, chartered by the federal government, and therefore, as the federal government, we're not subject to state laws like taxation. So we refused to do it. And truthfully, the reason that the reason that the state of Maryland had decided to tax the national bank was an attempt to tax it out of business, to tax it into bankruptcy so it would go away. So this ends up going all the way to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court ruled that one, the state of Maryland could not tax the national bank, that it was unlawful for them to tax the national bank, and the national bank was not subject to taxation by the states or any kind of state laws, on the grounds that it represented a part of the federal government. It existed really partially as an entity of the federal government, and the federal government was over the states. It was superior to the states and therefore not subject to state laws. To say that taxation power could come from the federal government down to the states, but it did not go the other way. And he said this was essential for everything to work. He uses what becomes a famous phrase. And when I say he, I mean John Marshall. Essentially, it becomes a famous phrase that the power to tax is the power to destroy. So if you give states the power to tax the federal government, then you could essentially give them the power to destroy it. And remember that that was kind of what Maryland was trying to do with this. But what's bigger about the McCulloch versus Maryland case? The bigger thing here, what really made this a landmark decision and what really increased the power of the federal government here, was this concept of implied powers. You might remember this concept of implied powers from earlier. Hamilton had suggested this decades before, the idea that Congress had implied powers that were created by the Elastic Clause, that there were additional powers beyond the enumerated powers that Congress had, again, having their basis in the Elastic Clause. And that had really been kind of a debate ever since then. So that was another issue that the court was looking at here. Finally, the court is looking at this ongoing issue of, is the national bank constitutional? And they ruled in McCulloch versus Maryland that it was. They said the national bank was constitutional by virtue of implied powers, saying that implied powers do exist. And so that's really how this increases the power of the national government. And if you remember nothing else, remember that McCulloch versus Maryland is the implied powers case. This is where the court asserts that there is such a thing as implied powers, and the Congress's power or the national government's power is not necessarily limited to only those things that were explicitly stated. So this becomes the basis for more implied powers to be exercised. Another important case that is very different, but is also going to increase the national government's power, is Gibbons versus Ogden. Now, sometimes people refer to this one as the steamboat case because it had to do with two steamboat companies. And to really try to simplify the backstory here, because as with court cases, as they all go, it's really the ruling, and that's what you really need to be concerned with. But it had to do with two steamboat companies operating on the Hudson River in the state of New York. And basically it boiled down to, and you can kind of look at this little cartoon up here, the state of New York had granted, there was one steamboat company owned by one guy, Gibbons. One was Gibbons, one was Ogden. I can't remember which was which. But one had a license to operate, like they gave them a monopoly, a license that basically said they and they alone got to operate steamboat traffic on the Hudson River. One of them had a license that was issued by the state of New York. The other had a license that was issued by the federal government. So they get in an argument about whose license was the correct one, the one that was issued by the state or the one that was issued by the federal government. So again, you have this federal power versus state power thing going on here. And what the Supreme Court ruled in this case was that the one issued by the state of New York was not valid, that the state of New York did not have the authority to issue that license, that only the one that was issued by the federal government was legitimate. And I can't remember whose was whose, but they're saying that the one issued by the federal government was legitimate. And the reason for it, not just because in any case, whatever the federal government says trumps what the state says, that's not what they mean here. What they get into here, and this is where it gets constitutional and where it gets fun, is they rule this on the grounds that the federal government and only the federal government has control over something called interstate commerce. Okay. Now, interstate commerce, and if you remember nothing else about Gibbons versus Ogden, this is the interstate commerce case. Interstate means going from state to state, okay, passing state lines, going over state boundaries and from one state to another. Commerce is business and trade and buying and selling of things. So interstate commerce is trade between states, okay? When we talked in the past about how under the Articles of Confederation, the national government couldn't regulate trade between the states, that means they could not regulate interstate commerce. Under the Constitution, there is a part called the Commerce Clause, and it specifically grants the federal government and the federal government alone the ability to regulate interstate commerce, trade from state to state. And what they were ruling in Gibbons versus Ogden is because those steamboats operating on the Hudson River. Well, the Hudson River goes through more than just the state of New York. It goes through New Jersey, it goes through a couple of other places. Therefore, it is interstate commerce, and therefore, only the national government can control it or make any kind of rules or regulations about it. So they're ruling that New York never had the authority to issue that license, because to do so would have been interfering, I guess you could say, or making rules about interstate commerce. And only the Constitution, or excuse me, only the national government can do that according to the Commerce Clause in the Constitution. So that may beg the question, well, if the Constitution says that, then why did the state of New York do it? Here's what's interesting about Gibbons versus Ogden, and here how it's really increasing the power of the federal government beyond the fact that they have ruled in favor of the federal government here. What the court does in the Gibbons versus Ogden case is they expand or they broaden the definition of interstate commerce. They interpret interstate commerce and the Commerce Clause to mean and include more things than they originally did, than what was originally understood to be the definition of interstate commerce. Interstate commerce had previously been understood to mean literally trade, buying and selling goods crossing state lines for sale. But what they interpret it to mean in Gibbons versus Ogden is essentially anything that crossed state lines, whether it's goods for sale or people on a riverboat or a steamboat, that is interstate commerce too. So they expand it to mean more things. And if you're expanding the idea of interstate commerce to mean more things and to include more things, then that means you're giving the national government control over more things. So this gives the federal government significant amounts of power by virtue of labeling all these things as interstate commerce and then giving the government the power to regulate them. So this doesn't get used so much here in this moment, but it comes up a lot later in the 19th century, early 20th century, when the federal government starts getting more involved in the regulation of business. They do that on the grounds of interstate commerce, that this is interstate commerce and we have the power to tell businesses that they can't do this or they have to do that or whatever, because it's interstate commerce. This is also used, just to give another modern day example of what we mean by interstate commerce, this is used in civil rights cases. This was how the federal government was able to order the desegregation of interstate bus systems. They said this is interstate commerce, and so we get to regulate it, we get to make decisions about it. And so states that are trying to enact segregation, we can intervene and say that they can't do that. We can ban that because this is interstate commerce. So we get to make those kinds of rules. So it enhances their power significantly, although sometimes that we don't see that oftentimes until a little bit later. So the significance of both of these cases is they both increase the power of the federal government. They enhance and expand the federal government's power. In both situations, the federal government was favored over the states, and also in both situations, the federal government's power was expanded, either by confirming that they had implied powers or broadening and expanding the definition of interstate commerce to mean more things. So judicial nationalism, meaning that even the court system was weighing in on these kinds of questions, and the national government growing by way of court cases and the interpretation of the Constitution by the Supreme Court. Next, we're going to move on to how nationalism shows up in foreign policy and how nationalism shows up in the United States' relationships with other countries. And here we're going to see a little bit, it's still kind of the same, well, maybe kind of the same foreign policy of neutrality and all of that, but we're starting to see it get chipped away at just a teensy little bit. But it's more in the attitude. It's really more in the attitude than the policy itself. And I think you'll understand what I mean when we get to it. So one of the first ways that we're going to see it is in the acquisition of some new territory. But before we look at that territory, we need to mention a specific individual, and that's John Quincy Adams. Now, you may recognize the name John Quincy Adams from his father, John Adams. So his father was John Adams, the second president. Some of you may also recognize that John Quincy Adams does eventually himself go on to be president, but at this point, he is Secretary of State. He is Secretary of State under President James Monroe, and John Quincy Adams is a big nationalist. He believes firmly in strong national power. He believes the United States needs to be strong. And as Secretary of State, and therefore assisting the president in directing foreign policy, he is going to, encourage Monroe to take a position of strength. And in fact, it's really argued that most of Monroe's foreign policy really isn't Monroe. It's really John Quincy Adams, who is the mastermind behind a lot of this stuff. So while Monroe's name gets attached to it, Quincy Adams is the one who's really pulling the strings there. But John Quincy Adams is to nationalism in foreign policy really what John Marshall was to nationalism in the courts. He really was behind a lot of that and pushes a lot of these much more assertive policies, wanting the United States to go from a position of strength. Not being aggressive. We're not talking about, the United States, launching imperialistic wars against people, but definitely saying, let's stand up for ourselves. And we're not going to be walked all over, the way that maybe we had been in the past. So one of the first ways we're going to see that with John Quincy Adams is with Florida, the acquisition of Florida. I get the question all the time, when do we get Florida? When do we get Florida? Well, it's right now. At this point in time, Florida is still a colony of Spain, but let's give a little context here. Spain by this point is nowhere near as powerful. They're still, they're fine. It's not like they're super, super weak, but they're certainly not as powerful as they were in the, certainly 1600s, even less than that. They too have been embroiled in wars with Napoleon that have not quite bankrupted them, but have, caused a lot of strain on them financially. Their empire in the Americas just isn't what it was, and they no longer have the ability financially or even the will to really defend it the way that they would like. And that's particularly true of Spanish Florida. So they just, it's not that they don't care about it. They're just really unable at this point to defend it all that well. And so the cost of it is kind of becoming too great for them. So that's Spain's side of it. At the same time, the United States has for a long time been interested in acquiring Florida, which makes sense. We know that it just makes sense. Here we have all of this, so why not this too? And up until this time, the United States had approached Spain multiple times about trying to buy Florida, and that had never amounted to anything. And so under the somewhere around 1817, 1818, I think it is, President Monroe orders Andrew Jackson from War of 1812, he sends him with forces into Florida. Now, the reason he was there to invade Florida was not to capture it. He was there to deal with the Native American threat because Florida had also become, as well as being a haven for runaway slaves, for escaped slaves, there were like entire communities in northern Florida of escaped slaves, actually, that had escaped from other parts of the South. But it was also a Native American threat. The Seminole Nation that was in Florida was particularly hostile to the United States, and it was made up mostly of defected Creeks that had defected from Creek nations out of Alabama, and had set up shop, I guess, or set up settlements in Florida, and then they would lead raids and such and attacks on American towns and everything, and then retreat back into Florida where they were kind of out of harm's way. So that's what Jackson was supposed to be doing, was weeding out that Native American threat. He was supposed to be attacking the Seminoles. But Jackson, probably with a nudging of John Quincy Adams, decides to take the opportunity just to take over all of Florida, and to capture the Spanish fort there because it wasn't very well defended. Spain was not able to really put a lot of forces in Florida. It was not very strongly defended, and Jackson decides to take advantage of that. So instead of just attacking the Seminoles, he attacks the whole Spanish fort and sets up a provisional government there, with Jackson himself kind of like as the governor of Florida. Now, all of this could be pretty provocative to Spain, and there were some in in Adams's cabinet who were like, "You need to tell Jackson we got to, apologize for this, and backtrack and all that kind of stuff, because this could inaugurate war with Spain. We just took over Florida, for crying out loud, without any kind of provocation." But John Quincy Adams, being the nationalist, wanting Florida anyway, sort of took it as, well, you know what? If Spain wanted to keep Florida, they should have defended it better. So that's ours now. And let's just negotiate from a position of strength. Now they'll have to let us have it because we're sitting here hanging on to it, and they're not going to go to war over it. And he turned out to be right about that. So this whole thing ends up in a treaty with Spain. Took a couple years to negotiate, but eventually we have the treaty, the Adams-Onis Treaty. Adams, of course, being the John Quincy Adams. And this is where Spain officially cedes Florida to the United States. So Florida officially becomes a part of the United States. So this is nationalism for a couple of reasons. One is you're adding territory. And anytime you're adding territory, that could really be considered nationalism because you're literally nation building. It's adding to the size of the United States. It's increasing settlement, therefore increasing potential economic opportunities. That is nationalism. But you can also notice here that this is a much different kind of land acquisition. This is one that was much more aggressive, where we kind of just went in and took what we wanted and then made demands from there. Shoot first, ask questions later kind of an idea, rather than the other way around. So it's much more assertive, much more risky, and a little bit more flexing a little bit more muscle, which Adams wanted, and he was careful in it. I mean, I don't. Maybe it was reckless, maybe it wasn't. He does choose an enemy carefully and successfully calculates that Spain isn't going to retaliate, and they didn't, and so they end up giving up Florida to the United States. Now, probably the most significant example of a nationalism in foreign policy, and one of the most significant foreign policy developments in this period, and probably one of the things that President Monroe is known most for as a president, is something called the Monroe Doctrine. But before we get to what the Monroe Doctrine is, we need to understand the context in which it was given. So the Monroe Doctrine is going to have to do with Latin America. It's a statement about American policy in Latin America. So let's get the context of what's going on there. So Latin America, you're talking about Central and South America, okay? Which, if we think back, those had been mostly colonies of mostly Spain, some of them Portugal and a few others, but we'll just say mainly Spain. But they had been colonies ever since, the 1600s, ever since the Spanish started coming over with Cortez and conquering and all that stuff. Well, by this time, we're looking at about 1819, 1820. By this time, there had been a string of democratic revolutions throughout Latin America. And once again, directly inspired by the American Revolution. So yet another way that the American Revolution was continuing to have an effect on the world, inspired by the same ideas of, we don't want to be ruled by a monarchy over the seas. We don't want to be ruled by people that are thousands of miles away from us. We want to rule ourselves, power to the people, setting up republics and democracies, and all those same kinds of ideas. So just as the American Revolution inspired similar movements in France and in Haiti, it eventually inspired similar movements from Mexico all the way through South America. So by 1819, 1820, most of those former colonies of Spain have declared independence and have fought numerous wars and won numerous wars for independence. And so we have all these newly free, newly independent, new fledgling democracies in Central and South America. Now, to Americans, of course, this was exciting. This was good that, democracy was winning out. And we probably, people welcomed the fact that Spain was no longer our neighbor to the south, or it wasn't Spanish territory, that these are now new democracies like us. And most Americans rather supportive of that. That, however, is not the case for a lot of European countries. So the response from some European countries, not all of them, but from some of them, was one of great concern. And keep in mind here, when I talk about European response, I do not mean all of them. The response we're talking about here really comes from the more autocratic European nations like Prussia, like Austria-Hungary, those that were still ruled by absolute monarchs. So you're not really talking about France. You're not even talking about Britain, which was still a monarchy, but really quite a democratic one. We tend to forget that. But the response from those more autocratic, more dictator-like, not democracies, those that were everything, that were really far away from democracy, they are very alarmed by this. These kind of countries view democracy as a danger, as almost like a disease that was starting to spread. Because when they thought of democracy, they thought of the chaos and the mess that you had in the French Revolution. And then you end up getting somebody like Napoleon, and we just finished fighting that guy. This is all bad. But they saw this as a serious problem, and that democracy was like a disease that needed to be eradicated. And so there was some talk amongst European countries, those more autocratic ones, talk about possibly recolonizing, about possibly trying to come back and stop these revolutions from happening and reestablishing European control in Latin America. Now, how serious they really were about that is questionable, but the talk of it, as you can probably imagine, didn't sit well with a lot of American leaders that worried about that. The idea of Europeans coming over and recolonizing the Americas, you can imagine that would strike a very sensitive chord with a lot of Americans. Now, It not only doesn't sit very well with Americans, it doesn't sit well with Great Britain either. Britain also doesn't want that to happen, mainly for economic reasons. And so British officials and ambassadors kind of approach American ambassadors and officials like John Quincy Adams, and they say, hey, you know what? We're not in favor of that. You know that. We know you don't like that. Let's kind of work together here. Let's just sort of make a statement together. Let's sort of take a stand together. Not talking about taking any kind of military action, but let's just sort of assert and say to these other countries that we don't support that we do not like them talking about that, and we're not going to tolerate it, and they better stop talking that way. Well, those are sentiments that people in Monroe's administration agreed with. But what John Quincy Adams advises is, okay, let's make such a statement. That's not a bad idea, but we don't need to do it with Britain. We don't want to look like we're just doing what Britain told us to do, so let's just do it ourselves. So already it is a nationalistic thing because the United States is on its own making this statement to Europe and basically saying, hey, Europe, here's what we expect you to do, and you better abide. So that statement becomes what we call the Monroe Doctrine. So the Monroe Doctrine is nothing more than a statement, but it's sort of a policy statement. It's just a part of Monroe's State of the Union address in 1820 or 1821. But here's what he says. And it's called the Monroe Doctrine, but it is Adams all over. He's really the one that wrote it, probably, and certainly that suggested it and all of that. But again, it's a statement about what's been going on in Latin America and what Europeans have been kind of threatening. In the Monroe Doctrine, the United States warns Europe, okay? It is a warning to Europe to stay out of Latin America, basically saying, we support what these democratic revolutions that have been taking place. We support these democratic countries, and you'd better as well. We are not going to tolerate any interference by European countries. It is sort of this part of the world is closed to you. The Western Hemisphere is closed to you. The days of you coming over here and establishing colonies and taking over everybody and conquistadors and all that business, that was fun, but it's over now, and you just need to stay on your little side of the world. Kind of like this cartoon shows. Here we have, let me point the right way, Uncle Sam there drawing this line in the sand, the Monroe Doctrine, showing these more autocratic rulers of Europe, this is the line, don't cross it. And it's very cleverly worded because it says that without really being threatening. It doesn't say, or we'll attack you. It doesn't say, or that's going to be an act of war. It just kind of says, this is the expectation that we have. And it also suggests that the United States will kind of be the protector of Latin America. It suggests that the United States will that we're kind of the ones in charge over here. That this side of the world, the Western Hemisphere, this is sort of our realm, and that's yours over there. And so if there's any problems in Latin America, you don't need to worry about it because we'll handle it. We will be the protectors and the preservers of liberty and democracy and all those kind of things over here. And that's really all it is. It's just a statement. But you can see here how this is nationalism. This is the United States flexing some muscle, saying this is our part and you need to stay over there. It does not outright threaten, but it also kind of suggests that the United States is going to take on a role in these Latin American countries, which the United States doesn't at this time, but eventually will. So I want to finish by going over the long-term significance of the Monroe Doctrine. So it's significant as a display of nationalism, a display of, again, force isn't quite the word, but it's certainly a flex move by the United States, as we might say today. But it definitely has long-term significance that you'll definitely want to remember because you're going to hear about this more, particularly next year starting really in the late 19th, well, really before that, but mostly late 19th century, but even until the present day. The Monroe Doctrine is later going to be used as justification for American policy in Latin America. We will see action and interference, what some might call just downright meddling in a lot of in Latin American countries, even wars of conquest in Latin American countries. And all sorts and covert operations in Latin American countries by the United States in the 19th century, in the 20th century, that have all been justified by the Monroe Doctrine. When later presidential administrations say we need to intervene in Cuba for this reason, because we're enforcing the Monroe Doctrine. We promised in the Monroe Doctrine that we would defend Latin America, that we would protect Latin America, and they need our protection, so we need to go do this. And that has been used to justify a lot of things, both good and bad. And that has also, and some of that good and bad is totally a matter of opinion, but that has also led to a lot of resentment amongst Latin American countries, some hard feelings, sometimes some good things, some good relationships, but it has also led to some tense relationships and affects some relationships with Latin American countries even today. So this at the moment is more just a statement. It's a flex, it's a power move, but nothing with any kind of tangible results, but it will have results in the decades to come for sure. So contributes to American foreign policy as it relates to Latin America. Now, expansion, as we just mentioned, is a cause of, or is related to nationalism. You're literally nation building. You are literally adding more territory, and that generally produces a lot of prideful feelings and excitement and economic opportunities, all things which are wrapped up into nationalism. But we also noticed that, or we've talked about how nationalism sometimes, or in many cases, breeds sectionalism, that it's directly related to sectionalism as well. So we're about to see that start happening. So in this age of nationalism and excitement and America this and American system that and Monroe Doctrine and all of that, sectionalism really has not ever gone anywhere. And we're about to see that rear its ugly head seemingly out of nowhere and cause a major sectional crisis in the middle of all of this nationalist excitement and fervor. And that is going to be when in 1820, when Missouri applies for statehood. So Missouri, this is the first state that's being added, or rather the first territory that's being organized and that is now applying for statehood that came out of that Louisiana Purchase territory. So it's the first time we're seeing an area west of the Mississippi being added as a new state. But this created a major national crisis because Missouri was applying for admission as a slave state. And if Missouri comes in as a slave state, it would tip the balance in favor of the slave states, which is what this little cartoon depicts here. At this moment, there was an equal number of slave states to free states. If Missouri gets added as a slave state, then it's going to tip that balance in favor of the slave states, which of course free states didn't want. But this also raises the question of the future of all of the Louisiana Purchase territory. Is slavery going to continue to be allowed to expand there? And there were people that said it absolutely should be allowed to expand, and there were people that said it absolutely should not be allowed to expand. So this was also a moment where that decision was coming up, and how do we decide this for the future? So this delays Missouri statehood. There's arguing back and forth until eventually an agreement is reached, and that agreement is called the Missouri Compromise, reached in 1820. And we're about to start seeing, I want you to keep looking out for over the next couple of weeks, this pattern of conflict and compromise, conflict and compromise. We're going to continue to see conflict, oftentimes over slavery, or almost always over slavery. Sometimes it might seem like it's about other things, but usually slavery is wrapped up in there somewhere. As the United States pushes westward, that is going to further and further exacerbate the slavery question and make that something that can't be ignored. And then we see compromise made, agreements made where everybody kind of gives in a little bit and we move on. But what we're going to see as time goes along is that these compromises get harder and harder to come by. They get harder and harder to reach, and they start lasting for smaller and smaller amounts of time until eventually compromise no longer becomes possible. But anyway, the Missouri Compromise reached in 1820, and the grand architect of the Missouri Compromise was Henry Clay, whom of course we know as part of the American system and all of that. And after this, Clay gets a reputation of also being this great compromiser. And this is first of several major compromises that he is going to design and get through Congress. Here's what they agree in the Missouri Compromise. One is that Missouri will enter as a slave state. So they get that. But at the same time, Maine is going to enter as a free state. Now, Maine, if you recall, had been part of Massachusetts ever since the colonial days. This is when it is going to break off and become its own state, Maine. So that will maintain the balance between the slave states and the free states. Missouri comes in as a slave state, Maine comes in as a free state. But then lastly, they also want to address this question about slavery in the rest of the Louisiana Territory. And so they decide in the Missouri Compromise that there'll be no further slavery or no more slavery above this coordinate, 36 degrees 30. So no more slavery above 36 degrees 30. That's a latitude longitude line, with the exception of Missouri. Missouri is actually above that, or almost all of it is. So basically, from here on, any new territories that are admitted beneath 36 degrees 30 will be allowed to have slavery, but any new territories that are organized above 36 degrees 30 will not. So they think that they have solved this problem for the future. So with that Missouri Compromise line, this is what we have if we want to look at it visually. So this is 36 degrees 30 right here. It is actually the southern boundary of Missouri. So Missouri does get still to have slavery, but anything else, this unorganized territory from the Louisiana Purchase, this is going to be closed to slavery, and anything underneath is open to slavery. Now, and this will be the rule for a while, but it won't be long before the United States gets all of this, and then we have the same question all over again. So the 36 degrees 30 line is drawn, and crisis kind of averted for the moment. But like I said, we will continue to see that, particularly once the United States continues to move westward. So we'll continue to look at the growth of sectionalism as we go along, and how these nationalistic policies oftentimes fueled more sectionalism.